We usually think of language and music as completely separate things. Language is meaning, music is sound, but there's a line of thought that reinterprets this, saying that music and language grew together, or rather that language was born out of music. So there's a theory from the book The Singing Neanderthals that thinks that early human language wasn't language altogether, but instead used something like a proto-system of rhythms, melody, and sound to communicate information. Closer to music than language, so to speak.
Margo, Margo.
And so because of this, maybe we shouldn't limit ourselves to just studying language through linguistics, but also studying it through musicology as well. I'll start with an aside about memory and its importance for both language and music. Language and music are both auditorily transferred. Neither language nor music originally needed writing. A lot of languages don't have writing systems to this day, around 3,000 if I'm not wrong. In places like Papua New Guinea, where linguistic diversity is extremely high, around 13% of the languages there exist without any writing systems at all, which is around 100 languages. And there are also many musical cultures with no musical notation at all, much like taiko drumming in Japan. Yet both language and music survive, and that is thanks to memory and oral transmission. Inner monologues help memory, and singing also helps memory. Greek choruses originally were made into song to help amateur performers memorize text through repetition, rhythm, and structure. There are recordings of people essentially singing speech, intertwining communication, rhythm, melody, instead of separating them into two distinct things. So both systems are based on something that is fleeting. Language and music is not documented. Knowing this about memory, we transition into the next important concept for both music and language, which is script. To keep music alive, and language as well, a culture has to translate it into something more permanent. Once you try to preserve language or music in written form, you run into a few problems, because sound exists in time and then it disappears. If you want to keep it alive, you have to decide what aspects of it are worth capturing. And this leads to three core problems specifically for musicology, which is documenting pitch, documenting time, and documenting simultaneity. Now, though these don't necessarily map cleanly to linguistics, I think it's interesting to look at what musicology does document and what it does study to see what other ways linguistics can be studied as well. So pitch exists in both languages and music, but unlike language, music chooses to represent pitch in their writing system. And they started documenting before modern notation, with systems designed to just remember pitch. One example of this is the Guidonian hand, which was invented by Guido d'Arezzo, which mapped pitches onto parts of the hand as a mnemonic system, not writing in the usual sense, but rather a way to physically encode the relationship between notes so that singers could memorize the melodic structure. And so this is where do, re, mi comes from. The syllables come from the first syllables of lines in a medieval Latin hymn, and Guido used them as teaching tools so singers could learn pitch relationships instead of memorizing the whole melody. And so over time, ut became do, and ti was added to complete the scale later on. So even early on, pitches in music were being structured, systematized, and very deliberately encoded. And eventually this became notation. But the point I'm trying to make is that music decided to represent pitch. And when compared to language, language doesn't write pitch down at all. But pitch does exist in tones in Mandarin, which is the most common example, in pitch accents in Japanese, in questioning tones at the end of a sentence, when you rise your pitch, in statements, and general intonation patterns like what determines a Valley Girl accent. I would argue that the Valley Girl accent is very much the third tone in Mandarin, and though these clearly affect meaning, they are mostly not represented in written language at all, maybe partially in systems like in pinyin, but not fundamentally. And so pitch is not completely absent in language, but it's just not something that language systems choose to document in writing, and maybe as a consequence, they're not as systematically studied as in music. I kind of wish there was a more standardized way of looking at language pitches, like standard practices when studying major or minor scales or consonant dissonance in words or sounds, like the systems in music. And if I have time, I'll make a website that gathers information about what people think of pleasant-sounding IPA sounds and unpleasant-sounding IPA sounds in languages across culture. If I'm done with it, if I write it, I'll put it in the description and you can go check it out. In any case, there seemed to be a big contrast between music and language. Music builds entire systems to encode pitch, and language leaves pitch mostly implicit. So the next point that music chooses to document is time. And it decides to write it down very explicitly, which is why in music you could see notes with different lengths, everything laid up on a grid, clear timings for when things happen. They have rests. You can literally see time in music, which you cannot see as explicitly in language. Of course, in theory, punctuation, or mainly commas or periods, are short sorts of pauses, sorts of moments of silence, but this is not standardized. Some languages do have different vowel lengths. You have short vowels and long vowels, like in Farsi, which makes it particularly poetic because of its long, short vowel combinations. Some languages use stress as rhythm, like English in poetry or Russian too, which is documented in this high art form, but not so much in regular speech. Music teachers tend to know that normal language is rhythmic, and I was seeing some videos on Instagram of music teachers taking viral phrases like just sigma riz, clock it, bra, and skibbity, and writing them down on a board as rhythmic patterns. Most normal people don't necessarily notice this in everyday conversation, but people whose goal is to be remembered or to be persuasive do put a lot of emphasis on this. Politicians and public speakers are either very intentionally aware of the rhythm or just are intuitively good at tracking and shaping it to their advantage. Speeches, especially political ones, tend to become more rhythmic. They rely heavily on repetition, like "I have a dream" or "yes we can," or simple patterns and parallel phrasing.
They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. Eat the cat, eat the cat.
People are naturally good at remembering rhythm, so if you want to be persuasive, you might as well have it on your side. So in contexts like poetry and political speeches, presentations, presenters tend to slow down, repeat, and structure phrases, almost like composing music in and of itself. In other words, when clarity and persuasion matters, speech starts to behave more like rhythm and music, or just music in general. Which is why it's a bit unfortunate that linguists don't talk about it as much as musicologists, I would say. Because apart from just persuasion, in our globalizing world of mixing cultures, it could lead to misunderstandings if these rhythmic patterns aren't well understood. Different languages have different understanding of pauses or silence and conversational rhythm, one could say. For example, in some cultures, longer pauses signal thoughtfulness and respect, while in others, the same pause can feel uncomfortable or disengaged. Similarly, overlap can be interpreted as enthusiasm, or in another context could be considered as an interruption. There have been a few studies about this, comparing response time across languages, showing measurable differences in how long people wait before speaking. The one that I was looking at was comparing a few languages, two of them being Dutch and Japanese. In Dutch, people take larger pauses, and so since I don't speak much Dutch, I can't reflect on that. But in Japanese, which I do speak, people were trying to show that they're engaging in conversation by nodding and verbally showing that they're following the listener with like, hi, so. There have been some linguists that look into this, specifically Deborah Tannen, who discusses this in terms of conversational style. She points out how small differences can escalate. For instance, if one person naturally speaks louder and the other person responds by speaking softly, the first person compensates by becoming even louder and the second even quieter, until one seems to be shouting and the other one barely speaking. And so the same dynamic appears in directness versus indirectness in emails, or perceived forwardness in conversation. Your pitch, your pauses, your rhythm, anything in language could result in misunderstanding, which is why it's very important that we study it. And the third difficulty is simultaneity. Music has a very clear way of handling polyphony. Music voices can exist at one time independently, but also synchronized with a shared timing system, which does not exist in language. It mostly avoids this. Conversations are structured around turn-taking. One speaks, and then another speaks, and then another speaks. And that is kind of how they've been studied for the most part. But that doesn't necessarily translate into reality. Different cultures allow different degrees of overlap, as I mentioned before. You can start speaking, and then that would be interrupting somebody else. and in certain cultures that is accepted and normalized, in others not so much. Some conversations tolerate or even encourage interruption, while others maintain strict separation between speakers. And so we do have a partial way of representing these parallel streams when it's necessary, such as subtitles on YouTube videos, sometimes with different colorings, or karaoke displaying multiple singers, or playwrights writing when someone should interject and speak over another. So it does exist in day-to-day language socially, but it's not as formally encoded as it is in music. Maybe it's worth looking into musicology and how musicologists study this overlap. Maybe there's cacophony in language too. Maybe the ways that we interject and interact and interrupt each other is systematic to a certain extent. But we won't know unless we test it. So now on to something that language does encode and music does not, and that is timbre. Timbre is what makes two sounds with the same pitch, same duration, feel different. Why a piano and a guitar don't sound the same, even if they're playing the same note, but also why the same instrument can sound completely different depending on how it's played. A violin can be played in a smooth and sustained manner, or in a sharp and scratchy one, a soft or aggressive, much like a piano note can be gentle and rounded, or bright and percussive. This is where the roles flip. Music doesn't document this in a very precise way, but language, to a certain extent, does. The way my digital musicology professor presented timbre to us was very similar to how I learned the International Phonetic Alphabet chart when I was studying phonetics. I have a full video on the International Phonetic Alphabet if you're interested, but essentially it's a system that maps out the sounds used across all languages and organizes them in a way that they're physically produced in the mouth. And it's very useful for normal people who are learning languages, but also opera singers use it, just because they have to know how to be able to pronounce all sounds to be able to sing pieces in different languages. So you can think of the IPA and timbre as these two spaces. There's a timbre space in music and a vowel or consonant space in the IPA. So while language or linguistics has a way to write out this space, telling you exactly how a sound is produced, music doesn't formally write timbre, leaving sound quality largely implicit. And musicologists are already using linguistic structures to understand this. I wouldn't be surprised if linguistics is where they got this inspiration from, to represent the space in music and document parts of this space, much like it's documented already in linguistics. There are very instrument-specific systems, much like there are very language-specific systems, where certain languages have tones and they document, certain languages don't and they don't care much about them. Certain languages have long and short vowels, certain languages do not. It's a question of what we try to represent and what is essential to that instrument or language. And there is a way of structuring these types of languages in linguistics, and that is logographs or monosyllabic languages like Chinese, where they have everything represented in one entity, or phonological languages like English, or I guess more so Russian or French or German, where you have an alphabet, you can read it. If you know the alphabet, you'll be able to read it. Or another type of languages is abjad languages like Arabic or Hebrew, where you document only the consonants and the long vowels. You have to implicitly understand which short vowels need to be added to be able to read it. And so I would want to kind of draw parallels to different categories of music too, maybe connecting the two in one way or another, where Arabic writing, which often omits short vowels, is a bit like jazz lead sheet. It gives you a framework, it gives you rhythm, structure, the chords that you need to use, but leaves the rest to interpretation. Jazz has chords where you can freestyle, much like Arabic doesn't document short vowels, so in a sense they all have this omission, leaving the rest to interpretation. Chinese writing, on the other hand, is closer to something like a full self-contained musical system, almost like a full multi-instrumental one-man band, or even an organ sheet containing all the information necessary for that moment in time or that character. Piano notation or any orchestral notation, especially in Western classical music, is more like German or Spanish or Russian, again, those fully alphabet-based languages with very specific alphabets and documenting exactly how one would read them, much like standard sheet music. So music and language are both trying to capture this fleeting sound, but they are choosing completely different parts of it to hold on to, reflecting what their system considers important. And so I wonder at times what wonderful things we could discover if we looked at language through the lens of music. Maybe we'd actually get further with pragmatics by studying interactions with the way musicology studies long pieces, tracking timing, alignment, and flow over time, or even in phonetics, if we took seriously which sounds feel pleasant or harsh across languages, instead of treating them as something secondary. Maybe even syntax would look different at larger scales, the way musical structures unfold beyond individual notes. There seem to be so many connections between the two, and it's surprising that we don't treat them as more closely linked. That studying the more musical aspects of language isn't already expected. Thank you for watching, and I hope you liked the video. Today I decided to go more a musical path. I usually make videos about animation, linguistics, and language learning, and so if you like any of those topics, please subscribe, maybe watch a few of my other videos. It helps me a lot more than you can imagine. As I mentioned before, I have a video about the International Phonetic Alphabet. I'll put it right here. I also have a video talking about world building and how linguistics can be beneficial for world building, and I'll put that one right here. And yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye!